Nobody walks into a courthouse expecting magic. People walk through those heavy doors carrying stress, carrying fear, carrying folders stuffed with documents that represent some of the worst moments of their lives. A courthouse is not a place where people smile easily. It is not a place where strangers make eye contact or strike up warm conversations in the hallway. It is a place where the air itself feels weighted thick with consequence, with judgment, with the knowledge that whatever happens inside these walls is going to matter for a very long time. The Jefferson County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, was no different. It stood exactly as it always had, tall, stone-faced, and completely indifferent to the lives swirling through its revolving doors every single morning. That particular Tuesday started the way every Tuesday started. The security guards took their positions at the front entrance before the sun had fully risen. The metal detectors hummed to life. The elevator doors opened and closed in a steady rhythm as clerks, attorneys, and courthouse staff made their way to their respective floors carrying coffee cups and leather briefcases. The marble floors echoed with the familiar click of dress shoes moving with purpose. Nobody wandered in the Jefferson County Courthouse. Everyone had somewhere specific to be and something specific to do when they got there. By 8:45 in the morning, Courtroom 7 on the third floor was already filling up. It was a mid-sized room with high ceilings, long wooden benches worn smooth by years of use, and tall, narrow windows that let in just enough light to remind you the outside world still existed. The American flag stood in the corner. The Ohio state flag stood beside it. The jury box sat empty, but not for long. 12 men and women filed in quietly and settled into their seats with the particular stillness of people who understand that what they are about to do carries enormous weight. Judge Patricia Harmon entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She always entered at precisely 9 o'clock. In 31 years on the bench, she had been late exactly once, and that was because of a verified weather emergency that had shut down half the city's roads. Her courtroom ran on a schedule so tight that her clerk once joked you could set your watch by the sound of her gavel. She was a tall woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back sharply and reading glasses that she wore low on her nose when she wanted to look at someone over them, which she did often and to great effect. Attorneys who had argued before her for years still felt a small jolt of nerves when those eyes landed on them over the rim of those glasses. She was fair. She was thorough. And she had absolutely no patience for anything that wasted the court's time. The case on the docket that morning was a civil matter with criminal undertones, a neighborhood dispute that had escalated badly enough to land everyone involved in a courtroom. It was not a glamorous case. It was not the kind of case that attracted journalists or cameras. It was the kind of steady, complicated, unglamorous work that fills the majority of courthouse days across America. Real people, real consequences, real emotions pressed flat under the formality of legal procedure. Defense attorney Mark Caldwell was already at his table, reviewing his notes with the focused energy of a man who had been preparing this cross-examination for weeks. The prosecutor sat across from him, equally prepared, equally composed. The room smelled like old wood and fresh coffee. Everything was in its place. Then the back doors opened. Sarah Malone stepped into the courtroom quietly, the way people do when they are acutely aware that they are entering a space with its own serious rules. She was 32 years old, dark-haired, wearing a neat gray blazer she had pressed that morning specifically because she wanted to look like someone who belonged in a courtroom. She had been called as a witness, not a defendant, not a plaintiff, just a person who had seen something and was now required by law to come and say what she had seen in front of a room full of strangers. She was nervous in the measured, controlled way of someone who is working very hard not to show that they are nervous. Beside her, holding her hand with both of hers, was Lily. Lily was 3 years old and 4 months, and she was wearing a pink dress with small white flowers along the collar because it was her favorite dress, and she had insisted on wearing it despite Sarah's gentle suggestion that maybe the blue one was more appropriate for a courthouse. Lily had considered this suggestion for approximately 2 seconds before rejecting it completely. The pink dress won. Lily's dark curly hair was pulled into two uneven pigtails, one slightly higher than the other, a detail Sarah had noticed but no longer had the time or energy to fix. Lily carried a small stuffed elephant named Gerald tucked under her left arm, and she surveyed the courtroom as she entered with the calm, curious expression of someone arriving at a party they were not entirely sure they had been invited to, but fully intended to enjoy regardless. Sarah had spent the entire morning preparing Lily for this moment. 45 minutes of patient, careful explanation delivered in the gentle but firm tone that mothers of strong-willed toddlers learn to use, firm enough to communicate seriousness, gentle enough not to trigger the particular kind of stubbornness that turns a simple outing into a full negotiation. She had explained that a courtroom was a very important place where people needed to be quiet and calm. She had explained that there would be a judge, a very important person who made very important decisions, and that the judge needed everyone to be respectful. She had explained that there would be lots of grown-ups doing serious work and that Lily's job, her one and only job that morning, was to sit still, stay quiet, and hold Gerald without throwing him. Lily had nodded through all of it with wide, earnest eyes. She had even repeated back the rules when Sarah asked her to, which Sarah took as an encouraging sign. They made it through the parking lot without incident. They made it through the security line without incident. They made it down the long, echoing marble hallway without incident. They made it through the heavy courtroom doors, and Sarah felt the first real loosening of tension in her chest. Maybe this was actually going to be fine. Maybe Lily was going to surprise her. Maybe all that preparation had actually worked. And then Lily saw Rex. He was positioned near the front of the courtroom to the left of the witness stand, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois with a dark, sleek coat, a broad chest, and amber eyes that scanned the room with the quiet authority of someone who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing. He wore his official vest. He sat in perfect stillness beside Officer Daniel Cruz, who stood with his hands clasped in front of him, watching the room with the same calm professionalism as his dog. Rex had been part of the Courthouse Comfort K9 program for nearly 2 years. He had sat through some of the most emotionally difficult proceedings that courtroom had ever hosted. He was, by every professional measure, an exceptional animal doing an exceptional job. But to Lily, none of that mattered. None of the training, the medals, the official vest, the professional posture meant anything at all to a 3-year-old girl with a stuffed elephant under her arm and absolutely no fear in her entire body. What Lily saw was simple. What Lily saw was a dog. A big, beautiful, real live dog sitting in the most serious room she had ever been in, looking like he needed someone to check on him. Sarah felt Lily's grip loosen in her hand. She tightened her own instinctively. For one brief moment, everything held. The attorneys shuffled papers. The jury settled in. Judge Harmon adjusted her glasses. The ordinary machinery of justice continued turning exactly as it was supposed to. 9:22 a.m., Courtroom 7, Jefferson County Courthouse. The day nobody saw coming had just officially begun. There is a particular kind of strength that cannot be taught in any training program, written into any manual, or developed through any drill on any field anywhere in the world. It is the kind of strength that only comes from being tested by real life, from facing genuine danger, genuine loss, and genuine pain, and choosing to keep going anyway. Most people spend their entire lives never discovering whether they possess this kind of strength. Rex discovered it before he was 3 years old. He was born on a cold February morning at a specialized K9 breeding facility outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, the largest in the state and one of the most respected in the entire country. His mother was a decorated Belgian Malinois who had served 6 years with the Cincinnati Police Department before retiring. His father had worked Federal Border Patrol for nearly a decade. From the very first moment Rex opened his eyes, the people who knew dogs looked at him and saw something different. It was not just his size, though he was larger than his litter mates from the beginning. It was not just his coloring, though his coat was unusually dark and rich. It was something in the way he watched things. Most puppies see the world as a collection of things to play with. Rex watched the world the way a student watches a teacher. Like every single thing happening around him was information he intended to keep. His trainer, a veteran K-9 instructor named Carl Witherspoon, who had developed police dogs for over 20 years, noticed it during Rex's very first assessment at 8 weeks old. While the other puppies in the litter tumbled over each other chasing a rubber ball, Rex sat at the edge of the group and watched the ball move. He tracked its bounce, its direction, the way it changed speed on different surfaces. When it finally rolled to a stop near his paw, he sniffed it once, looked up at Witherspoon, and sat down. Witherspoon later told Officer Cruz, the man who would become Rex's permanent handler, that in 2 decades of working with K-9 candidates, he had never seen a puppy demonstrate that quality of focused observation at 8 weeks old. He said it plainly, without exaggeration, the way experienced people state facts they have no reason to dress up. Rex was different. Rex was special. And the work ahead of him was going to prove it in ways nobody could have predicted on that cold February morning. Training was intense in the way that only K-9 police training can be, physically demanding, mentally exhausting, and deliberately designed to simulate the most chaotic and dangerous situations a working dog might ever encounter on the street. Rex moved through every phase with a consistency that impressed even the most experienced trainers on staff. Obedience training, scent detection, suspect apprehension, building searches, crowd control. He absorbed each new skill with the same focused patience he had shown as a puppy watching that rubber ball. He made mistakes, every dog does, every human does, but he never made the same mistake twice. That was the thing about Rex that trainers kept coming back to in their evaluations. He learned permanently. Whatever entered his understanding stayed there and built upon itself, creating a foundation of knowledge and instinct that grew stronger with every passing week. He graduated at the top of his class. That was not a surprise to anyone who had watched him train. What surprised people was the margin. Rex did not edge out his classmates by a small measure. He outperformed the entire group so consistently across every category that Witherspoon recommended him for the narcotics division immediately, bypassing the usual rotation that most new K-9 graduates cycled through before receiving a specialized assignment. It was an unusual move. It was also exactly the right one. Officer Daniel Cruz was assigned as Rex's handler 6 weeks after graduation. Cruz was 34 years old at the time, a compact, quietly intense man with 10 years on the Columbus Police Department and a reputation for being exceptionally good at difficult, unglamorous work. He was not the kind of officer who sought attention or made noise. He showed up, he did his job with complete dedication, and he went home. When the department told him he was being paired with the most promising K-9 graduate in the program's recent history, he nodded, shook Rex's paw with great seriousness, and got to work. Their partnership developed the way the best partnerships always do, slowly at first, then suddenly all at once. Cruz learned Rex's rhythms. Rex learned Cruz's patterns. Within 3 months they were operating with a fluency that took some handler dog teams years to develop. They communicated without words, without signals sometimes, just through the particular quality of attention each paid to the other at any given moment. Cruz always knew when Rex had caught a scent worth following. Rex always knew when Cruz needed him to hold position and wait. It was the kind of working relationship built on complete mutual trust, and it made them formidable. For 2 years they worked the streets together, and the results were extraordinary. Rex located drug caches that had been hidden with professional sophistication, sealed in airtight containers, buried under concrete, masked with chemical agents designed specifically to fool K-9 noses. He found them anyway. He tracked suspects through rain, through crowds, through environments deliberately designed to break a scent trail. He apprehended individuals who were dangerous enough that human officers approached with extreme caution. He did all of it without hesitation, without failure, and without ever losing the quality of calm focus that had distinguished him from the very beginning. Then came the night everything changed. It was a raid on a warehouse on the east side of Columbus, a location intelligence had flagged as a major distribution point for a narcotics operation that had been under investigation for 8 months. The raid was carefully planned and professionally executed. Cruz and Rex entered with the second team, moving through the dark interior with the tight efficiency of long practice. Everything was going according to the plan right up until it wasn't. A heavy steel door that had been propped open swung shut without warning, whether from a draft or deliberate sabotage. Nobody ever determined conclusively. It caught Rex at full speed mid-stride with the full force of solid metal slamming into his right shoulder. The sound was terrible. Cruz heard it over the noise of the raid and felt his stomach drop before he had even fully registered what had happened. Rex went down. He made no sound, not a yelp, not a cry, which somehow made it worse. He simply went down and lay still, with the particular stillness of an animal, absorbing serious pain in complete silence. The shoulder was badly damaged. The veterinary team that treated Rex that night used words like significant and complex and long recovery in ways that told Cruz everything he needed to know without saying the thing directly. Rex's street career was over. The dog who had never failed at anything was being pulled from the work that had defined him, through no fault of his own, because a door had swung shut at the wrong moment. Cruz refused to accept a quiet retirement for Rex. He sat beside him through every day of recovery, through the surgery, through the slow and painful rehabilitation, through the frustrating weeks when Rex would attempt to rise and work before his body was ready. Cruz brought his case to the department supervisor with the focused persistence of a man who had thought the argument through from every angle. Rex was not finished. Rex had more to give. The Courthouse Comfort K9 program was expanding and needed experienced animals with proven temperaments. Rex qualified in every measurable way. The department agreed. Rex was reassigned. Everyone assumed it would be a quiet conclusion to a remarkable career, a gentle wind down for a dog who had given everything and earned a softer assignment. What nobody understood yet was that the courthouse was not a lesser version of Rex's work. It was a different kind of battlefield entirely. The street had demanded his speed, his nose, his physical courage. The courthouse demanded something deeper. His ability to read human emotion, to offer presence without pressure, to sit beside people in their most broken moments and simply be steady. Rex was extraordinary at all of it. He sat beside children testifying about things no child should ever have to testify about, and his calm warmth held them together when nothing else could. He positioned himself near anxious witnesses and somehow, without doing anything technically definable, made them breathe easier. Attorneys noticed it. Judges noticed it. The courthouse staff talked about it quietly among themselves, the way Rex seemed to understand exactly who in the room needed him most and move accordingly. He had been doing this work for nearly 2 years when Sarah Malone walked through those courtroom doors with a pink-dressed, curly-haired, completely fearless 3-year-old who looked across that serious room and decided that the big dog near the front needed someone to check on him. Rex had survived the streets. He had survived the raid. He had survived the surgery and the long recovery and the transition to a completely different kind of work. He had never once in his life encountered anything quite like what was about to walk straight down the center aisle toward him. He had no idea it was coming. Neither did anyone else. There are children who come into the world quietly. They arrive soft and observant, taking everything in slowly, testing the edges of new experiences with careful, cautious steps. They hold their mother's hands in crowded places. They hide behind familiar legs when strangers speak to them. They cry at loud noises and flinch at sudden movements and require patient, gentle coaxing before they will trust something or someone they have never encountered before. These children are not weak. They are simply wired for caution, and caution is a perfectly reasonable way to move through a world that is large and unpredictable and full of things that have not yet been explained. Lily Malone was not one of these children. Lily had arrived in the world the way she arrived everywhere, loudly, immediately, and with complete confidence that whatever was happening around her was something she fully intended to be involved in. Sarah Malone liked to say that Lily had come out of the hospital looking for someone to talk to. Her pediatrician, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Ellis, who had delivered hundreds of Bobbies over a long career, had looked at newborn Lily during her very first checkup and told Sarah with a small, knowing smile that this one was going to keep her busy. He had no idea how right he was. By 18 months, Lily was walking with the purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere important to be. By 2 years old, she was asking questions that Sarah sometimes genuinely did not know how to answer, not because the questions were beyond Sarah's knowledge, but because they were beyond what Sarah had expected a 2-year-old to be curious about. Why does the sky get dark? Where does the wind come from? Why do grown-ups cry when they say they are fine? These were not questions Sarah had been preparing for. She had been preparing for questions about why vegetables were necessary and why bedtime existed. Lily skipped those entirely and went straight for the philosophical ones. She was fearless in a way that was both breathtaking and quietly exhausting to parent. Dogs that made other toddlers freeze with uncertainty made Lily stretch her hand out immediately, palm flat, the way Sarah had taught her, not because Lily was afraid and needed a safe protocol, but because Lily had decided that introducing herself properly to a dog was simply the correct and respectful thing to do. She had no concept of a dog being dangerous. In Lily's experience, every dog she had ever met had been wonderful, and she saw no logical reason to believe the next one would be any different. This was either beautiful innocence or a complete gap in risk assessment, depending on which moment of the day you were observing it. Thunderstorms rolled through Columbus with regularity, and while neighboring children pressed themselves against their parents at the first crack of thunder, Lily stood at the living room window with her nose against the glass and watched the lightning with open fascination. She called it the sky sparkling. She asked Sarah if the clouds were angry or just being dramatic. Sarah had said she honestly wasn't sure, and Lily had nodded seriously and said that she thought they were probably just being dramatic because they always felt better afterward. Sarah had not had a response to that. She was the child at the playground who climbed to the highest point of every structure without hesitation, not from recklessness, but from a genuine and unshakable belief that she was capable of whatever she decided to attempt. She was the child who walked up to other children she had never met and simply began playing alongside them, as if a formal introduction was an unnecessary formality between people who were clearly going to be friends. She was the child who, at a birthday party for a classmate she barely knew, had walked directly up to the father of the birthday child, a tall, serious-looking man standing alone near the food table, and told him that he looked like he needed some cake and that she would help him pick a good piece. The man had laughed for the first time in what his wife later described as several very difficult months. That was the thing about Lily that went beyond simple fearlessness. Fearless children exist in reasonable numbers, children who climb too high and run too fast and speak too loudly in quiet places. What made Lily different? What made people stop and take notice even when she was doing something as ordinary as walking into a room was that her fearlessness was connected to a quality of attention that was unusual in someone her age. She noticed people. She noticed when someone in a room was sitting differently than everyone else, when a face was holding something heavy behind a polite expression, when an animal was being very still in a way that might mean it needed acknowledgement. She did not have words for any of this observation. She simply responded to it, the way very young children sometimes respond to things that adults have long since learned to walk past without seeing. Sarah had first noticed it when Lily was barely 2.5. They had been at the grocery store on a busy Saturday morning, the aisles crowded and loud, both of them moving quickly through the list. An elderly man was standing in the cereal aisle, holding a box of oatmeal, staring at the shelf with an expression that Sarah had registered only vaguely as she passed, something tired and far away in his eyes, something that did not quite belong in a cereal aisle on a Saturday morning. She had pushed the cart forward and thought nothing more of it, but Lily had stopped. Lily had looked at the man for a long, quiet moment. Then she had tugged on Sarah's sleeve, pointed back at him, and said in her straightforward 3-year-old way, "Mama, that man is sad. We should say something nice to him." Sarah had paused, turned around, and walked back. She had said something simple and kind to the man, who had looked up with such genuine surprise at being seen that his eyes had filled. He had thanked her quietly and moved on. In the car afterward, Sarah had sat for a moment before starting the engine, thinking about the fact that her 2-year-old had noticed something she had walked right past. She thought about that moment often in the months that followed. The morning of the courthouse visit, Sarah had done everything right. She had fed Lily a good breakfast, eggs and toast, not the sugary cereal Lily preferred, because Sarah believed firmly that a nutritious breakfast produced a calmer child, a theory Lily had never once confirmed through actual behavior, but which Sarah continued to hold on to. She had dressed her in the pink flower dress over Lily's enthusiastic approval, and Gerald the stuffed elephant had been packed and ready since the night before. Sarah had reviewed the courthouse rules twice during the car ride and once more in the parking lot, crouching down to Lily's level, holding both her small hands, making genuine eye contact the way all the parenting resources suggested. Lily had been perfect through all of it. She had held Sarah's hand through security. She had whispered, actually whispered, in the elevator, which was a small miracle Sarah had privately celebrated. She had walked into courtroom 7 with her chin up and Gerald tucked properly under her arm, and had taken her seat beside Sarah on the long wooden bench without a single complaint about the hardness of the wood, which was impressive because it was genuinely quite hard, and even Sarah found it uncomfortable. For 4 full minutes, Lily sat still. Sarah counted them. She counted them the way parents count every second of unexpected cooperation, storing it carefully like something precious that might not last. It did not last. Because 4 minutes into sitting still in courtroom 7, Lily shifted slightly to her left to adjust Gerald's position under her arm, and in doing so, her line of sight opened up past the edge of the wooden bench in front of her, past the row of seated attorneys, past the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the main floor of the courtroom, and landed directly on Rex. He was magnificent, even from a distance. Even in a room full of serious and important things competing for attention, Rex was impossible to miss. He sat in perfect stillness near the witness stand, his dark coat glossy under the courtroom lights, his broad chest forward, his amber eyes moving steadily across the room in a slow, professional scan. He wore his official vest with its patches and insignia. He was, by any objective measure, the most impressive animal Lily had ever seen in her entire life. But that was not what held Lily's attention. What held Lily's attention was something else entirely, something she felt rather than saw, the way she had felt something in the grocery store while standing in the cereal aisle. Rex was doing his job perfectly. He was sitting exactly where he was supposed to sit and doing exactly what he was supposed to do. But underneath all of that professionalism, underneath the training and the discipline and the official vest, Lily perceived something that every adult in the room had simply accepted as appropriate workplace behavior. Rex was sitting there all alone, surrounded by serious people doing serious things, and nobody had checked on him. Nobody had acknowledged him. Nobody had asked him how he was doing. Nobody had recognized, the way Lily immediately recognized, that even the most capable and impressive individuals in a room sometimes need someone to simply look at them directly and ask if everything is all right. Lily turned this over in her mind for approximately 4 seconds. Then she made her decision. Sarah felt the small hand slip from her grip like water through open fingers. There one moment and completely gone the next. She turned and saw Lily already 3 steps into the aisle, pink dress swishing, Gerald abandoned on the bench, walking toward the front of the courtroom with the calm, unhurried confidence of someone who has identified exactly where they need to be and sees no reason to delay getting there. Sarah reached out. She caught nothing but air. And Lily kept walking. There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with the absence of sound. Courtrooms are rarely truly silent. There is always the shuffle of papers, the creak of wooden benches, the quiet scratch of a pen moving across a legal pad, the almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system cycling air through a room full of people doing serious, concentrated work. These sounds exist constantly in the background of any active court proceeding, so familiar and consistent that the people inside the room stop hearing them entirely, the way a person who lives near a highway eventually stops hearing the traffic. The sounds become wallpaper. They become the neutral backdrop against which everything else happens. The silence that fell over Courtroom 7 that Tuesday morning was not the absence of those sounds. Those sounds continued exactly as they always had. The ventilation hummed. A pen scratched somewhere in the jury box. A paper shifted on the prosecutor's table. The silence that fell was something different. It was the silence of every conscious human mind in that room, simultaneously stopping what it was doing and redirecting its full and complete attention to a single point in the center of the courtroom floor. It was the silence of 34 people, all holding the same breath at exactly the same moment without having coordinated it in any way. It was the silence that a 3-year-old girl in a pink flower dress created simply by walking forward. Mark Caldwell had been building toward this moment in his cross-examination for the better part of 40 minutes. He was a precise and methodical attorney, the kind who constructed his arguments the way a watchmaker constructs a mechanism, each piece placed with exact intention, each movement designed to lead inevitably to the next, the whole thing ticking toward a conclusion that felt, by the time it arrived, completely inevitable. He had spent 3 weeks preparing this particular cross-examination. He had anticipated every direction the witness might turn, every deflection they might attempt, every emotional response that might require a shift in his approach. He had war-gamed it in his office, at his kitchen table, in the car on the way to the courthouse that morning. He was ready for everything. He was not ready for Lily. Nobody in the history of Mark Caldwell's legal career had ever interrupted him mid-sentence in an active court proceeding. Opposing attorneys had tried and been shut down by judges. Witnesses had attempted to redirect and been pulled firmly back on course by his follow-up questions. Once, a man in the gallery had stood up and shouted something incoherent, and Caldwell had barely paused before the bailiff removed the man, and he continued exactly where he had left off as though nothing had happened. He was not a man whose concentration broke easily. He had spent years building that concentration into something close to unbreakable. It broke in approximately 1.5 seconds. He heard the sound first, the small, light percussion of tiny shoes moving across the courtroom floor with surprising purpose and confidence. It registered in the outer edge of his awareness as something out of place, the way a wrong note registers in familiar music before you have consciously identified it as wrong. He kept his focus on the witness for 1 more beat, 2 more words, and then the sound continued in the wrong direction for too long and his concentration cracked, and he turned his head. Lily was 7 steps into the main floor of the courtroom, and moving with the unhurried certainty of someone following a path they had already decided on completely. She was not sneaking. She was not rushing. She was not looking back over her shoulder at her mother or sideways at the jury box or up at the judge. She was looking straight ahead at Rex with the focused attention of a person who has identified their destination and sees no reason to be distracted from it by anything happening on either side. Her pink dress shifted gently with each step. Her dark curly pigtails, one still slightly higher than the other, bounced with the rhythm of her walking. Her small hands swung at her sides in the loose, easy way of a person who is entirely comfortable with where they are going. Caldwell stopped talking. It was involuntary. His mouth simply closed around the next word and did not open again, because some part of his brain that operated below the level of legal strategy and professional discipline had recognized that something genuinely unprecedented was happening in his courtroom, and that the appropriate response was silence. The witness on the stand, a middle-aged man named Gary Prout, who had been visibly uncomfortable for the better part of 40 minutes, looked up from the table in front of him to see why the questioning had stopped. He followed Caldwell's gaze to the center of the room. His expression shifted from defensive wariness to something much closer to pure bewilderment. The jury noticed the change in the room the way juries always notice changes, collectively, simultaneously, like a single organism responding to a shift in its environment. Heads turned. Bodies leaned forward. 12 people who had been carefully tracking the details of a civil dispute found themselves tracking something else entirely, something that had no category in their juror orientation materials and no precedent in anything they had been told to expect. Judge Patricia Harmon felt the shift before she fully registered its cause. 31 years on the bench had given her an almost physical sensitivity to the atmospheric changes in a courtroom. She could feel when a jury was losing focus, when a witness was about to break, when an attorney had overplayed their hand and the room was turning against them. She felt something change now and looked up from her notepad with the sharp, immediate attention of someone who has learned never to ignore that particular instinct. She saw Lily. For exactly 2 seconds, Judge Harmon did nothing. She simply looked, and in those 2 seconds, something happened behind her eyes that the bailiff, a man named Curtis who had worked alongside her for 12 years and considered himself a careful student of her expressions, had never seen before. The professional composure was still there, the careful neutral face that decades of judicial discipline had made almost permanent. But underneath it, in the slight softening around her eyes and the almost imperceptible loosening of the set of her mouth, something was happening that Curtis would later describe to his wife as watching a window open in a wall you had always assumed was solid. Lily reached the center of the courtroom. She stopped. She stood directly in front of Rex with perhaps 4 feet of open floor between them, and she did something that nobody in the room had expected based on everything that had happened in the preceding 30 seconds. She did not rush forward. She did not reach out immediately to touch him. She stopped and she looked at him, really looked at him, with the same quality of focused, unhurried attention that she had given him from across the room, now concentrated into something much more direct and personal at close range. Rex looked back at her. The room held its breath. Then Lily planted both of her small fists firmly on her hips. It was a gesture so perfectly, completely committed, elbows out, weight shifted slightly back, chin tilted upward at an angle that communicated absolute seriousness of purpose, that it seemed almost choreographed, like something from a film where the director had told the child actor to give everything they had and the child had delivered beyond all expectation. There was nothing tentative about it. There was nothing uncertain or performative about it. It was the posture of a person who had something important to say and intended to say it properly. She drew a small breath. And then, in a voice that was clear and bright and loud enough to reach without any difficulty whatsoever the back row of the gallery, the corners of the jury box, the elevated bench where Judge Harmon sat with her pen frozen above her notepad, and every single one of the 34 people in that room who had been holding a collective breath for the past 40 seconds, Lily spoke. "Excuse me, doggy, are you doing a good job today?" The words landed in the silence of that courtroom like a stone landing in still water, perfectly clear, perfectly round, sending ripples outward in every direction simultaneously. They were 11 words. They were spoken by a 3-year-old girl in a pink dress with uneven pigtails who had walked across an active courtroom because she had decided that the dog near the witness stand needed to be checked on. They were, by any conventional legal or professional measure, the most out-of-place 11 words that had been spoken in Courtroom 7 in living memory. They were also, somehow, exactly the right words at exactly the right moment. For one full second after Lily finished speaking, the silence continued deeper now, more complete, the silence of a room in which every person has just heard something that has temporarily suspended their capacity for ordinary response. Then it broke. It broke the way things break when they have been held too long under pressure, suddenly and completely all at once, with no gradual release. A juror in the second row, a woman in her 50s named Margaret who had served on 2 previous juries and prided herself on her composure, made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely, something warmer and more vulnerable than laughter. The sound spread. It jumped from person to person around the room the way fire jumps between dry things, unstoppable once it has found its first purchase. The court reporter lifted her fingers from her keys and pressed them against her mouth instead. 2 attorneys at the defense table turned simultaneously toward each other and then immediately away again, both of them pressing their lips together with the particular desperation of people trying very hard not to laugh in a place where laughing is technically inappropriate and completely failing. The prosecutor, a young woman named Dana Reeves who was 3 years into her career and still occasionally intimidated by the formality of courtroom proceedings, laughed openly and immediately, and then covered her mouth with both hands and looked at Judge Harmon with the wide eyes of someone who has just done something they are not sure will have consequences. Gary Pruitt on the witness stand, a man who had been visibly braced against the pressure of cross-examination for the better part of an hour, sat back in his chair, and the defensive tension that had been holding his shoulders up near his ears released all at once, and he laughed in a way that sounded like something he had genuinely needed to do for a long time. And Judge Patricia Harmon, who had not laughed in an active court proceeding in 11 years, who had built a career on the principle that a courtroom was a place of serious consequence that demanded and deserved the full gravity of everyone's attention and behavior, Judge Patricia Harmon laughed. Not a polite, controlled acknowledgement of something mildly amusing. A real laugh. A laugh that started somewhere genuine and arrived in the room completely unfiltered by 31 years of judicial discipline. A laugh that made Curtis the bailiff stare at her with an expression he would spend the rest of the day trying to adequately describe to people who had not been in the room to witness it. 45 seconds. That was all it had taken. 45 seconds from the moment Lily's small shoes first touched the courtroom floor to the moment her 11 words broke open something in that room that nobody had realized needed breaking. 45 seconds in which a 3-year-old girl with uneven pigtails and absolute conviction had walked into the center of a space designed for gravity and consequence, and had filled it, without trying, with something that every single person in that room had needed far more than they had known. And through all of it, through the laughter and the frozen court reporter, and the openly weeping defendant in the back and the judge who had forgotten, just for a moment, to be a judge, Rex had not moved. He had not startled at the noise. He had not shifted or looked toward his handler for guidance or done any of the things that the sudden eruption of sound around him might reasonably have prompted. He was looking at Lily. Only at Lily. And the expression in his amber eyes, if an expression is something that can live in the eyes of a dog, and everyone in that room who saw it in that moment would spend years quietly insisting that it absolutely can, was something that looked, unmistakably, like recognition. Like he had been waiting. Like she had arrived exactly on time. Officer Daniel Cruz had been standing in the same position for the better part of 2 hours. Left foot slightly forward, right hand relaxed at his side, left hand holding Rex's lead with the loose but ready grip of someone who has done this long enough that it no longer requires conscious thought. He had developed this stance over years of courthouse work, present enough to be professional, still enough not to draw attention, alert enough to respond instantly if anything in the room required it. It was the physical expression of everything Courthouse K9 work demanded: calm, contained, ready. He had maintained that stance through testimonies that made hardened attorneys look away. He had maintained it through emotional outbursts from gallery members, and through tense sidebar arguments between opposing counsel, and through the particular suffocating quiet of a jury returning with a verdict that everyone in the room already suspected was going to devastate someone. He had maintained it through 2 years of everything a courthouse could produce, standing steady beside Rex while the human drama of justice played out around them in every form it takes. He lost it completely the moment he realized what Rex was about to do. It started with a signal so small that anyone who was not Daniel Cruz, anyone who had not spent 3 years working beside this specific animal in every condition imaginable, would have missed it entirely. Rex shifted his weight, not dramatically, not with any obvious preparation or telegraphing of intention. Just a subtle redistribution, barely a quarter-inch of movement in how his body was carrying itself, the way a person shifts before they stand from a chair, a movement that happens below the level of decision, in the part of the body that acts before the mind has fully committed. Cruz felt it through the lead before he saw it. The leather changed tension in his hand by a fraction that would have been meaningless to anyone else, and was, to him, as loud as an alarm. He looked down at Rex with the sharp attention of someone who has just received information they were not expecting and found Rex already in motion, not moving yet, but oriented, the whole of his powerful body subtly reorganized toward Lily the way a compass needle reorganizes toward north. Purposeful. Inevitable. Already decided. Every protocol Cruz knew activated at once. Rex was a working animal in an active court proceeding. The rules around K9 behavior in judicial settings existed for serious and well-considered reasons. A working dog that responds to civilians during proceedings creates liability, disrupts the court's authority, and compromises the professional integrity of the K9 program itself. Rex was not a therapy dog. He was not a pet. He was a trained law enforcement animal operating in a formal legal environment, and the behavior Cruz could feel building in him right now was outside every boundary of what was permitted in this room. Cruz tightened his grip on the lead. He shifted his weight forward, preparing to issue the quiet, firm redirect command that he and Rex had practiced until it was as automatic as breathing. He opened his mouth. He had the word ready, the single, soft word that in 2 years of partnership had never once failed to bring Rex back to position. Rex looked up at him. It was the look that stopped Cruz entirely. Not defiant, Rex had never been defiant in his life, had never operated from anything resembling stubbornness or resistance to authority. It was something else, something that Cruz struggled for a long time afterward to put into words when people asked him to describe it. The closest he ever got, in the many interviews and conversations that followed in the weeks and months after that day, was this. It was the look of a professional who has assessed a situation and made a judgment call. It was the look of someone who is telling you, without any words, that they understand the rules completely and have decided that this specific moment represents an exception that the rules were never designed to anticipate. Cruz had trusted Rex with his safety on dark streets in dangerous neighborhoods. He had trusted Rex's nose over his own eyes more times than he could count. He had trusted Rex's instincts in situations where the consequences of being wrong were severe and immediate. He made a decision in approximately 1 second. He loosened his grip on the lead. Rex moved. Not quickly. Nothing about what Rex did in those next moments was quick or sudden or dramatic, in the way that people who were not in the room sometimes imagined it when they heard the story later. Rex moved the way he moved through everything, with complete deliberateness, with the economy of motion that belonged to an animal that had never wasted a single movement in its life. He turned his large, dark head toward Lily fully, bringing the whole of his attention to bear on her the way he had brought it to bear on 1,000 things before, with absolute focus, absolute presence, nothing held back and nothing distracted. Lily was still standing with her fists on her hips. The laughter in the room had begun to settle into something softer, not silence, not quite, but the kind of warm, wondering quiet that follows laughter when the thing that caused it turns out to be more beautiful than funny. People were watching. Everyone was watching. But they were watching the way you watch something you are afraid to breathe on in case it disappears. Rex studied Lily's face for a moment that felt, to the people watching, much longer than it actually was. He was reading her the way he read everything, completely, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion before the information was fully gathered. He read the open brightness of her eyes, which held no fear and no agenda and nothing complicated at all. He read the slight forward tilt of her small body, which was not aggressive but was intensely engaged, the posture of someone leaning towards something rather than away from it. He read the quality of her stillness, which was the stillness of genuine waiting rather than the stillness of someone suppressing movement they wanted to make. And then Rex made a sound. It was quiet enough that the people in the back rows of the gallery did not hear it. They pieced it together afterward from descriptions given by those who had been closer. The people near the front heard it clearly. Officer Cruz, standing 3 feet away, heard it with a clarity that he later said went straight through him like something physical. It was a sound that did not fit neatly into the vocabulary people normally use to describe the sounds dogs make. Not a bark, not a whine, not a growl, not the bright, eager vocalization of an excited animal. It was softer than all of those things and more complex than any of them. It was the sound of something being released, something that had been held with great discipline for a very long time finding, in this specific moment, a specific person it was safe to release toward. Curtis the bailiff, who had been standing near the side wall watching everything with the careful attention of a man whose job requires him to notice things, described it later as the sound of a very tired soldier finally being given permission to put down something heavy. Rex leaned forward. He brought his massive head broad and dark, and carrying the weight of everything he had survived and everything he had been trained to contain, and he rested it, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible given his size, against Lily's small shoulder. The room went completely still. Not the held-breath stillness of shock, which was what had filled the room 40 seconds earlier when Lily had first begun her walk down the aisle. This was different. This was the stillness that comes after something has happened that people recognize, in some part of themselves that operates below language, as true. As real in a way that most things inside a courthouse, for all their legal weight and formal consequence, never quite manage to be. Lily did not flinch. She did not startle or step back or look around for her mother. She looked down at Rex's head resting on her shoulder with an expression of complete and uncomplicated satisfaction, the expression of someone whose assessment of a situation has been fully confirmed. She had come down here because she believed Rex needed to be checked on. Rex had just confirmed, in the most direct way available to him, that she had been right to come. She brought both arms up and wrapped them around his neck. She was so small and he was so large that her arms barely reached halfway around him, but she held on with the particular grip of a child who means it, not tight enough to be uncomfortable, not loose enough to be casual. The grip of someone who understands, without being told, that the creature in their arms has given them something real, and that the appropriate response is to receive it with equal realness. Rex exhaled, a long, slow, complete breath that moved through his whole body. Officer Cruz, standing 3 feet away with a loosened lead in his hand and 31 protocol violations running through one part of his brain, while the rest of him was completely unable to move, felt something happen in his chest that he was not going to describe to anyone in any official capacity, but that he would think about on quiet nights for years afterward. He did not redirect Rex. He did not issue the command. He did not step forward and restore order and professional distance, and all the correct and appropriate boundaries that his training and his regulations and his deeply held professional pride told him he absolutely should be restoring right now in this moment. He stood still, because some things are more important than protocol. Not many things, not most things, but some things, specific things that arrive without warning in the middle of ordinary days and ask you to recognize them for what they are. Some things are more important than protocol. And Daniel Cruz, who had spent his career making correct decisions under pressure, made what he would quietly consider the most correct decision of that career in that moment by doing absolutely nothing at all. In the jury box, Margaret, the composed woman in her 50s who had broken first, was no longer trying to manage her expression. She was watching Rex and Lily with the open face of someone who has temporarily stopped being a juror and is simply being a person, which is sometimes the most important thing a person in a jury box can do. Gary Prude on the witness stand had his hands flat on the table in front of him and was looking at the floor. His shoulders were moving in a way that made it clear he was crying, which was something he had not done once in 3 days of testimony about a dispute that had cost him considerably. Later, when asked by a journalist what had made him cry in that moment, he thought about it for a while before answering. He said, "It wasn't sad. That's the thing. It was the opposite of sad. And I think that's what got me. I'd forgotten what the opposite of sad felt like." And at the elevated bench, Judge Patricia Harmon had set her pen down. She had removed her glasses. She was sitting very still with her hands folded in front of her, and she was watching a 3-year-old girl hold a police dog in the middle of her courtroom, and she was not reaching for her gavel. She was thinking about something she had not thought about in a very long time. She was thinking about why she had wanted to be a judge in the first place. Not the career of it, not the achievement of it, not the 31 years of careful and serious work that had built her reputation into something substantial and lasting. The original reason, the reason that had existed before any of that. The reason that had been there at the beginning, young and unguarded and completely certain of itself, before the years of difficult cases and hard decisions, and the necessary emotional discipline of someone who must remain fair to everyone had layered over it like sediment over something precious. She remembered it now. She remembered it clearly, sitting behind her bench in courtroom 7, watching a little girl in a pink dress hold a police dog who had pressed his head against her shoulder and exhaled like he had been waiting for exactly this. Judge Patricia Harmon remembered exactly why she had wanted to do this work. And she made a decision. There is an unwritten law in American courtrooms that operates alongside all the written ones, older than most statutes, more consistently enforced than many regulations, and understood by every person who has ever spent significant time inside a courthouse regardless of which side of the bar they stood on. It is the law of the bench. The bench is not simply a piece of elevated furniture. It is not merely the physical location from which a judge conducts proceedings. It is a symbol so deeply embedded in the culture and tradition of the American legal system that its meaning extends far beyond anything that can be captured in a job description or a procedural manual. The bench represents authority. It represents neutrality. It represents the careful, permanent separation between the person who must decide and the people whose lives will be affected by that decision. A judge on the bench is not simply a person doing a job. A judge on the bench is the embodiment of something larger than themselves. The idea that justice, at its best, operates from a place of elevated, dispassionate wisdom that cannot be swayed by emotion or proximity, or the particular human warmth of any individual moment. Judges do not leave the bench during active proceedings. This is not a written rule in the way that evidentiary standards are written rules. It does not appear in any procedural code or judicial conduct manual with that specific phrasing. It does not need to. It is simply understood by every attorney who has ever argued before a judge, by every clerk who has ever handed documents up to the bench, by every bailiff who has ever stood beside one. The way the most fundamental things are always understood, without needing to be said, without needing to be enforced, simply known. In 31 years, Judge Patricia Harmon had never left the bench during an active proceeding. Not once. Not for any reason. She had presided over cases that had lasted weeks, through testimonies of such devastating emotional weight that attorneys on both sides had requested recesses simply to compose themselves, and she had remained exactly where she was, present, composed, unwavering in her position. She had sat through moments that had tested the emotional reserves of every other person in the room, and had held her place at the bench the way a lighthouse holds its position through weather, because that was what the lighthouse was for. That was what she was for. Curtis the bailiff knew this better than anyone. In 12 years working alongside Judge Harmon, he had developed a comprehensive understanding of her professional habits, her rhythms, her preferences, and her absolute non-negotiables. He knew which attorneys she found genuinely impressive and which ones she found merely loud. He knew that she took her coffee black and that she read case materials the night before rather than the morning of. He knew that she had a particular patience for witnesses who were nervous and a particular impatience for attorneys who were theatrical. He knew the 11 different variations of her silence and what each one meant. He knew her the way you know someone after 12 years of close professional proximity, not perfectly, not completely, but well enough that surprises had become essentially impossible. He thought surprises had become essentially impossible. He was watching Rex and Lily the same way everyone else in the room was watching them, with the particular quality of attention that beautiful, unexpected things command, the kind that bypasses all your usual filtering and lands directly in whatever part of you has not yet been made entirely practical by adulthood. When he became aware, in the peripheral edge of his vision, of movement at the bench, he turned. Judge Harmon had set her pen down. This was not unusual. She set her pen down regularly during proceedings. She had removed her reading glasses. This was slightly less usual but still within the range of normal. Then she placed both palms flat on the surface of the bench in front of her, and she pushed back her chair. Curtis stopped breathing. She rose from the bench with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who has made a complete and considered decision and is now simply carrying it out. She did not look around the room to gauge reactions. She did not hesitate at the edge of the elevated platform. She descended the 2 steps from the bench to the main courtroom floor with the same measured composure that characterized everything she did, and she began to walk. Nobody in the room made a sound. The laughter that had filled the space minutes earlier had already softened into something quieter and more wondering, and now even that dissolved completely into a silence so total that the ventilation system, that constant, unnoticed hum that had been running in the background of the entire morning, became suddenly, distinctly audible. Every eye in the room was on Judge Harmon. Every person was completely still. The attorneys at both tables had turned in their chairs. The jury box was a row of identical expressions, wide-eyed, motionless, trying to process something that had no category in their experience of how courtrooms worked. Gary Pruitt on the witness stand had looked up from the floor and was watching with his hands still flat on the table, and his face still carrying the open, unguarded quality that crying in public sometimes leaves behind. Judge Harmon crossed the courtroom floor toward Lily and Rex. She walked the way she did everything, without performance, without self-consciousness, without any apparent awareness of or concern for the extraordinary nature of what she was doing. She simply walked, and the room held itself completely still around her as she did, the way a body of water holds still when something moves through it that commands that stillness without demanding it. She reached Lily. She stopped. And then Judge Patricia Harmon, 31 years on the bench, iron reputation. The woman who had once cited a man for contempt because his phone had vibrated too loudly in his shirt pocket, bent her knees and lowered herself, in her full judicial robes, until she was crouching at the eye level of a 3-year-old girl. The bailiff Curtis, A man who had worked in courtrooms his entire adult life and considered himself thoroughly unsentimental about the legal process, later told his wife that he had felt, in that specific moment, something shift in the room that he did not have precise words for. He said it was like watching a very tall wall develop, without any warning or structural reason, a door. He said he had not expected to feel anything in particular, and had instead felt something he was still thinking about weeks later when he tried to describe it. Judge Harmon looked at Lily directly, not in the way adults often look at small children, slightly downward, slightly indulgent, the gaze of someone operating from a position of significantly greater knowledge and experience, who is making a kind effort to bridge the distance. She looked at Lily the way she looked at everyone who appeared before her bench, directly, completely, with the full weight of her attention brought to bear without reservation or distraction, as an equal. As a person whose presence in this room was legitimate, and whose perspective on what was happening here deserved to be taken seriously. Lily looked back at her with identical directness and no intimidation whatsoever. Judge Harmon extended her right hand. Lily looked at it for exactly 1 second, long enough to register what was being offered and decide how she felt about it, and then she reached out her own small hand and shook it, firmly, with the same matter-of-fact confidence she brought to everything. Sarah, watching from the gallery with both hands pressed over her mouth, made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something that was not a laugh at all. Judge Harmon held Lily's hand for a moment after the shake, not shaking it anymore, just holding it, the large and the small together in a stillness that the sketch artist Dana Holloway, sitting in her usual spot along the side wall, was already translating into line and shadow on her pad with the focused urgency of someone who understands they are looking at something that will not happen again exactly this way. Then Judge Harmon spoke. Her voice was quiet, pitched for Lily and perhaps the first 2 rows, not for the room, but the room was so completely silent that it carried without effort to every corner. "I need you to know something important," she said. "You were absolutely right to come down here and check on him. Rex is doing a wonderful job today. He does a wonderful job every day. But I think today especially, having you here with him, he is doing his very best work." Lily considered this information with great seriousness. She looked from Judge Harmon to Rex and then back to Judge Harmon. She nodded once, the decisive, conclusive nod of someone who has received a satisfactory answer to an important question and is now prepared to move forward accordingly. "Okay," Lily said, "good." 2 jurors laughed. It was the soft, helpless laughter of people who are completely full of something and have run out of room to hold it quietly. Judge Harmon stood. She turned to Curtis, who had moved to stand a respectful distance away with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he knows will stay with him and is still in the process of fully accepting that it happened. She looked at him with the clear, decided expression he knew meant that something had been resolved and the decision was final. "Bring a chair," she said quietly. "A small one if we have it. She stays for the remainder of her mother's testimony." Curtis moved immediately. He did not ask for clarification. He did not exchange a glance with anyone or pause to consider the procedural implications of what had just been requested. He walked to the side of the courtroom and returned within 90 seconds carrying a small wooden chair, one of the chairs from the conference room down the hall, lower to the ground than the standard courtroom seating, and placed it beside Rex with the careful, deliberate placement of someone who understands that where he sets this chair matters. He set it close enough to Rex that Lily could maintain contact without stretching, close enough that Rex's warmth and solid presence would be immediately available. He stepped back and looked at Judge Harmon and gave the small nod that meant it was done. Judge Harmon turned to the room. The composure was back, fully back, complete and professional, the judicial face that 31 years had made into something very close to permanent. But something underneath it had changed, and the people who had been watching closely enough could see it, a quality of openness that had not been there before, subtle as a change in light but unmistakable once noticed. She looked at the attorneys. She looked at the jury. She looked at the witness on the stand, who had straightened slightly in his chair and was watching her with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who has been reminded, unexpectedly, that the system they are currently caught inside is operated by human beings. "We will continue," she said. Her voice was exactly as it always was, measured, authoritative, final. "Mr. Caldwell, please proceed." Caldwell stood. He looked at his notes. He looked at the witness. He opened his mouth and found with some surprise that the precise and carefully constructed pressure of his cross-examination had rearranged itself slightly in the preceding minutes, not weakened, not lost, but somehow recalibrated. He was still going to ask the same questions. He was still going to pursue the same truth. He simply felt, for a reason he did not immediately understand and would spend the drive home trying to articulate, that he was going to do it slightly differently than he had planned. He proceeded. And in the chair beside Rex, Lily settled in with the comfortable authority of someone who has been told they belong somewhere and found the information entirely unsurprising. She rested one small hand on Rex's back. Rex did not move. He resumed his professional stillness, the scanning gaze, the composed posture, the focused presence that was his work and his gift, and the thing he did better than almost anything. But his tail, barely visible beneath the edge of his vest, moved once, a single, slow, certain sweep. Curtis saw it. He looked at Officer Cruz. Cruz looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more completely than words were going to manage. The proceedings continued. The ventilation hummed. Papers shuffled. The afternoon light shifted in the tall, narrow windows of Courtroom 7, moving across the floor in the slow, indifferent way that light moves through rooms where important things are happening, illuminating everything and explaining nothing, leaving the meaning entirely to the people inside. And the people inside, every one of them, carried something out of that room when it was finally over that they had not carried in. Dana Holloway had a system. Every courtroom artist develops one eventually, a personal methodology for deciding what to capture and what to let pass, for reading the room quickly enough to identify the moment before it finishes happening, for translating the living, breathing complexity of human experience into lines on paper before the experience moves on, and leaves you holding an incomplete sketch of something that no longer exists exactly as it did 10 seconds ago. Dana's system had been refined over 14 years of sitting in courtrooms across Ohio with a pad on her knee and a set of charcoal pencils worn down to varying lengths depending on how much use each shade had seen. She was good at her work. She was precise and fast, and had a particular gift for capturing expression, for finding the specific arrangement of a face that revealed what was happening beneath it rather than simply what was being presented to the room. She had never once, in 14 years, gone home from a courtroom assignment and immediately posted her work online. She had a professional protocol around the use and distribution of courtroom sketches that she followed carefully and consistently. She did not share work from active cases without clearance. She did not post images that might compromise proceedings or prejudice anything still under judicial consideration. She understood her role in the legal process, and she respected its boundaries the way a person respects boundaries that exist for good reasons. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the sketch in front of her and looked at it for a long time. She had drawn it during the moments when Judge Harmon had risen from the bench, capturing the image from the angle of the side wall where she always sat, which gave her a view that took in Lily and Rex in the foreground, and the packed, stunned courtroom receding behind them into the middle distance. She had worked quickly, the way she always worked, her hand moving with the practiced urgency of someone racing a moment to its conclusion. But something had happened in the drawing of this particular sketch that did not always happen in 14 years of courthouse work. Something from the room had entered the drawing, not just the visual information, the shapes and proportions and the specific angle of Lily's chin, and the exact position of Rex's lowered head, but something underneath the visual information. Something that lived in the space between the lines rather than in the lines themselves. She had looked at it on the train home and felt it. She had looked at it again in her kitchen and felt it more strongly. It was the thing that good artwork does when it is working. It holds the feeling of the moment rather than just the appearance of it, so that a person looking at it who was not present for the original experience can nonetheless feel something true about what it was like to be there. Dana was not a person who used social media extensively. She had accounts on the major platforms because her work occasionally required visibility, but she used them sparingly and without much personal investment. She was not someone who thought carefully about captions or engagement or the particular craft of presenting things online for maximum impact. She was an artist, not a content creator, and the distinction mattered to her. She typed one sentence. She did not labor over it. She did not write and delete and rewrite the way people do when they are trying to craft something. She typed what she actually felt, which was the only thing she knew how to do, and it came out in 11 words that were in their own way as simple and direct as the 11 words Lily had spoken in that courtroom earlier that day. She just needed to make sure he was okay. She attached the sketch. She posted it. She put her phone face down on the table, made herself a cup of tea, and went to bed. She woke at 6:15 the following morning to a sound she did not immediately recognize, her phone, buzzing with a frequency and persistence that she had never experienced before, vibrating against her nightstand with the frantic energy of something that has exceeded all reasonable expectations and has no intention of slowing down. She picked it up with the blurred, unhurried confusion of early morning and looked at the screen, and then sat up very quickly and looked at it again. 47,000 shares. She sat with that number for a moment. Then she put the phone down. Then she picked it up again because she was not entirely convinced she had read it correctly. She had. She set it down a second time and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the wall and tried to understand what had happened between the moment she had gone to sleep and this moment, and found that she could not entirely process it through the ordinary channels of morning comprehension. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at her phone more carefully. The sketch had traveled in the night the way only certain things travel online, not through any single large platform or prominent account sharing it first, but through hundreds of individual people sharing it simultaneously, each of them sending it to the specific person or group in their life who they felt needed to see it. The organic and unstoppable spread of something that has touched a nerve so universal that the impulse to pass it forward feels almost involuntary. It had moved through Facebook pages and Twitter threads and Instagram stories, and text message chains and family group chats and workplace Slack channels, and every other digital pathway through which Americans in the 21st century share the things that matter to them. By 9 in the morning, it had been picked up by 3 regional news stations in Ohio. By noon, it had been shared by 2 national news accounts with combined followings in the millions. By 3 in the afternoon, the story had broken fully into the national conversation. Television producers were calling Dana's number, which she had not given anyone, and which several of them had found through means she did not want to think about too carefully. The Washington Post had a reporter working on a feature. The Associated Press had sent an inquiry. Good Morning America had left a voicemail that began with the words, "We would love to have you," and the sketch on the show, in a tone of such enthusiastic warmth that Dana listened to it twice trying to determine whether it was real. She called Officer Cruz. She had spoken to him briefly on her way out of the courthouse the previous day, and had taken his card with the vague professional intention of following up if her editors needed a quote for anything. She called him now because it felt like the right thing to do, to warn him, to give him the information that his and Rex's lives were about to become significantly more complicated in the next 48 hours. Cruz answered on the second ring. She told him what was happening. There was a long pause on his end of the line. Then he said, "How many shares did you say?" She told him again. Another pause. Then quietly, the way a person speaks when they are trying to sound composed and are not entirely succeeding, "I need to tell Rex." Dana laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since waking up, and it felt necessary and good. The story, as it spread, changed in the specific way that stories always change as they move through the large and complicated organism of American public attention. Details were added by people who had not been there. The timeline shifted slightly in some retellings. The precise words Lily had spoken were quoted with minor variations in different outlets, each version slightly more or less formal than the original depending on the sensibility of whoever was telling it. This is what stories do. They metabolize through the people who carry them, and they come out changed on the other side, carrying the fingerprints of every person who passed them along. But the essential thing, the thing at the center of it that was true and that every version of the story, however it varied in the surrounding details, managed to preserve intact, that thing did not change. A small girl had walked into a serious room and asked a powerful dog if he was doing a good job. The dog had answered in the only way available to him. And an entire courtroom full of adults doing important, serious, consequential work had stopped, had actually, physically, completely stopped, because what they witnessed in that exchange was something they recognized, something they needed, something they had not known until that exact moment was missing from their day, or perhaps from much longer than their day. This was what America responded to. Not the cuteness of it, though it was undeniably and completely cute. Not the novelty of it, though it was certainly novel. People had shared cute and novel things 1,000 times before without them spreading like this, without them landing in the particular deep place that this landed. What America responded to was the recognition. The thing Lily had done, the act of walking across a room because she had noticed that someone capable and impressive and professional was sitting there alone and had decided that this someone deserved to be checked on, was something that resonated in people not as an observation about a child or a dog, but as a mirror. A small, pink-dressed, uneven pigtailed mirror, held up to a country that was very tired and had been working very hard and moving very fast and was perhaps, without having named it this way, in need of someone to walk over and ask whether it was doing okay. Letters arrived at the precinct within days. Actual physical letters, handwritten on notebook paper and lined stationery and the backs of printed emails, from people across the country who wanted to tell Officer Cruz and Rex something that felt too personal and too specific to trust to a comment section. A woman in Portland wrote that she had shared the sketch with her father, who had been having a very hard month, and that he had looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then said, "That dog deserved that. Everybody deserves that." A teacher in rural Georgia wrote that she had shown it to her 4th grade class, and that a boy who had not spoken in 3 weeks of school had raised his hand and said that he thought the little girl was brave. A veteran in Colorado wrote 2 pages about what it meant to him that a child had instinctively understood that the one keeping watch needs watching over too. Dana read every letter that was forwarded to her. She read them at her kitchen table in the evenings, the same table where she had sat the night of the sketch with her cup of tea, not yet knowing what was coming. She read them, and she thought about the 11 words she had typed without laboring over them, and she thought about the 11 words Lily had spoken without laboring over them, and she thought about how often the truest things arrive without effort, not because they require no courage to say, but because once you have decided to say them, the saying itself is simple. Rex received an official commendation from the Franklin County Sheriff's Department 17 days after the sketch went viral. The commendation cited his service record, his courthouse work, and in language that the sheriff's office legal team had apparently spent some time considering before including, his demonstrated capacity for instinctive and appropriate emotional response in service of the court's broader mission. It was the most carefully worded commendation in the department's recent history, and it made Officer Cruz laugh when he read it, which was the intended effect. Rex received it with the equanimity he brought to everything. He accepted the formal ceremony, the assembled officers, the cameras, the sheriff shaking his paw with great seriousness, with the composed, slightly bored patience of a professional who understands that public recognition is part of the work even when it is not the part of the work that interests him. He sat where he was told to sit. He stayed when he was told to stay. He looked at the cameras when people pointed at them and said his name. Then the ceremony ended, and he returned to courtroom 7 and resumed his position beside Officer Cruz and went back to the actual work, which was the only part that had ever mattered to him anyway. 3 rose back in the gallery. On the first day he returned after the commendation, a woman waiting to testify looked at Rex and leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something. The person beside her smiled. Across the room, without hearing the whisper, a juror was looking at Rex with an expression that people who had been in courtroom 7 3 weeks earlier would have recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone who had just been reminded of something important. It was the expression Lily had put there. And it was not, it turned out, going anywhere. There is a particular kind of change that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or formal declaration or the visible drama of something large and obvious shifting into a new position. It arrives quietly, the way light arrives in a room when someone in another part of the house opens a curtain. You do not see the moment of opening, you simply become aware, gradually and then all at once, that the room is different than it was before, brighter, more navigable. Somehow more itself than it had been in the dimmer version that preceded it. You did not witness the change happening. You simply find yourself standing in the result of it, and something in you recognizes, without needing to be told, that the result is better than what came before. This is the kind of change that Lily Malone left behind in Jefferson County Courthouse. Not the dramatic, visible, institutional kind that makes headlines and gets cited in policy documents, though that kind came too, eventually, in its own time and through its own channels. The change that came first, the change that preceded all the formal recognition and the official proposals and the commendations and the national attention, was the quiet kind, the kind that lived in people. The kind that altered, by some small but permanent degree, the way the human beings who worked inside those marble walls moved through their days and understood their work, and looked at the people around them who were also doing that work. Curtis the bailiff felt it first, because Curtis was the kind of person who noticed things first. He noticed it on the Thursday of the same week, 2 days after the Tuesday that had changed everything, when he arrived at the courthouse at 7:45 in the morning and found himself, without having planned to, stopping in the hallway outside courtroom 7 and looking through the small rectangular window in the door at the empty room inside. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. He was not thinking about anything specific. He was not reviewing the day's schedule or running through procedural considerations or doing any of the practical morning things his mind normally occupied itself with during the early part of a courthouse day. He was simply looking at the room, at the wooden benches worn smooth by years of use, at the tall, narrow windows letting in the early morning light, at the spot near the witness stand where Rex had been sitting when Lily walked toward him. He realized after a moment, checking on it. The room. He was doing, in his own adult and considerably less direct way, exactly what Lily had done, pausing to acknowledge something he walked past every day, something so familiar it had become invisible, and choosing for a moment to actually see it, to recognize that it was there and that it mattered, and that the work that happened inside it was worth a moment of genuine, unhurried attention before the day's machinery started turning. He stood there 30 seconds. Then he straightened his jacket and walked on, but he carried the 30 seconds with him through the rest of the day in a way he could not entirely explain and did not try to. Judge Patricia Harmon's formal proposal reached the desk of the Franklin County Court Administrator on the 14th day after the Tuesday in question. It was 4 pages long, single-spaced, written in the precise and thorough legal language that characterized everything Judge Harmon produced in a professional capacity. It made the case, methodically, with supporting citations from existing research on trauma-informed court practices and the documented efficacy of animal-assisted interventions in judicial settings involving children. For expanding the Courthouse Comfort K-9 program to include mandatory certified animal presence in all family court proceedings, where minors were either testifying or present as affected parties. The proposal was not sentimental. It did not reference Lily by name. It did not describe the events of the Tuesday in any narrative detail or appeal to the emotion of what had happened in Courtroom 7 as a justification for the policy change. Judge Harmon was too careful and too professional for that. She built her case on evidence and precedent, and the documented outcomes of similar programs in other jurisdictions, and she made it as airtight and objection-resistant as anything she had ever submitted in her career. But the people who received it and read it and ultimately approved it without a single dissenting vote knew what had prompted it. They knew because they were part of the same professional community, because word travels in courthouses the way it travels in all close-knit institutional environments, completely and quickly, regardless of whether anyone intends it to. They knew, and not one of them said so in any official context, and not one of them needed to. The proposal passed in 11 days. It was one of the fastest approvals in the court administrator's recent memory. The expanded program began 6 weeks later. On its first day of full operation, 3 children who had been scheduled to testify in a family court proceeding, children for whom the prospect of entering a courtroom had been, according to their caseworkers, a source of significant and documented distress in the weeks leading up to the hearing, walked into the room, saw the certified Comfort K-9 positioned near the witness area, and visibly settled. One of them, a 7-year-old boy named Marcus who had not spoken above a whisper in any of his pre-testimony preparation sessions, walked directly to the dog, sat down beside him on the floor without asking anyone's permission, and began talking. To the dog, initially. Then gradually, naturally, without any forced transition, to the people in the room who needed to hear what he had to say. His case worker, a woman named Teresa who had been doing this work for 9 years and had seen many difficult things in those 9 years, wrote in her session notes that evening that she had never witnessed a child move from nonverbal anxiety to coherent testimony in that period of time or with that quality of calm. She noted the presence of the K-9 as a contributing factor. She used the word transformative, which was not a word she used often in case notes because she believed in precise, conservative language for professional documentation. She used it here because it was the accurate word, and she could not find a more conservative one that was also true. Officer Daniel Cruz read about the program expansion in the department newsletter and sat with it quietly for a while. He thought about the fight he had put up 2 years earlier to keep Rex working after the injury, the careful, persistent case he had made to supervisors who were sympathetic but uncertain, the paperwork, the meetings, the slow work of convincing an institution that something unconventional was worth trying. He thought about how close it had come to going differently. He thought about Rex sitting in Courtroom 7 right now, doing his work, being exactly what he was, and he thought about all the Marcus-sized children in all the difficult rooms ahead who were going to walk in and find a steady, warm, completely reliable presence waiting for them, because a decision had been made 2 years ago to give an injured dog a second assignment. He thought about Lily. He thought about her often. He had framed Dana Holloway's sketch himself, had taken it to a framing shop on a Saturday morning, stood at the counter for 10 minutes deliberating over matting options, with a seriousness that the young woman behind the counter found either touching or excessive, and had ultimately chosen a dark walnut frame with a simple cream mat that let the sketch breathe without adding anything unnecessary around it. He had hung it in the precinct break room at eye level, not high on the wall the way institutional art is usually placed, tilted slightly downward and meant to be glanced at rather than seen, but at the eye level of a person standing at the coffee machine, which was where people in the precinct stood when they had a moment between the demanding parts of their day. People stopped in front of it, not always for long, sometimes just a pause, a glance, a moment of stillness before the coffee was poured and the day resumed. But they stopped. Officers who had been on difficult calls, clerks who were behind on their paperwork, detectives who had been sitting with cases that were not moving. They stopped in front of the sketch of the small girl with her fists on her hips and the big dog looking at her. And they carried something from the stopping that was different from what they had been carrying before they stopped. And Cruz noticed this and did not say anything about it to anyone because it did not need to be said. Rex noticed too, in his way, not the framing or the placement or the institutional significance of what his photograph represented in the break room. Rex noticed that the people who came to him in Courtroom 7 were, in those weeks, sometimes slightly different than they had been before. Not dramatically different, not transformed in any obvious or theatrical way, just more open occasionally, more willing to be seen, more likely to make eye contact with him when they entered the room rather than looking past him at the floor or the ceiling or the middle distance of their own anxiety, as though something in the building had shifted, very slightly, toward acknowledging that presence mattered, that being seen mattered, that someone noticing you and choosing to engage with you rather than past you was not a small thing, regardless of the formality of the setting or the seriousness of the occasion. Rex received all of this with his usual composure and gave back exactly what he had always given: steadiness, warmth, the complete reliability of a creature that does not have complicated days and does not bring unresolved feelings to its work and does not need to be asked twice to show up fully. He was, in the weeks and months that followed, exactly what he had always been. The difference was that more people were paying attention. Sarah Malone followed the stories spread through the news with the particular mixture of pride and bewilderment that belongs to parents of children who have done something publicly remarkable, proud in the deep, unqualified way, and bewildered in the equally deep way, because the child who is remarkable in public is always also the child who put her stuffed elephant in the refrigerator last Tuesday and cannot consistently remember which shoe goes on which foot. The two versions of Lily, the one that had walked into a courtroom and stopped time, and the one who was currently negotiating bedtime with the focused determination of a labor attorney, existed simultaneously in Sarah's experience, and the gap between them was both enormous and entirely invisible to Lily herself. A journalist from a Columbus lifestyle publication called Sarah 3 weeks after the story broke and asked if she would sit for an interview. Sarah agreed, on the condition that Lily not be photographed or named beyond her first name, which the journalist accepted without argument because she understood entirely. They sat in Sarah's kitchen on a weekday afternoon while Lily napped, a nap she had resisted for 45 minutes before surrendering to it in the middle of the living room floor with Gerald the elephant under her cheek. Sarah talked about that morning. She talked about the car ride and the courthouse rules, and the 45 minutes of careful preparation, and the 4 minutes of actual compliance that had preceded everything. She talked about the moment she had felt the small hand slip from her grip, and had reached for it and caught nothing but air. The journalist asked the question everyone had been asking in their various ways since the story broke. What did Lily remember about that day? What did she understand about what she had done and the effect it had produced? Sarah was quiet for a moment. She looked toward the living room, where Lily was asleep on the floor with her dark curly hair spread around her head, and one small arm extended in the particular abandoned sprawl of a child in genuinely deep sleep. She looked at her daughter for a long moment with the expression that parents sometimes have when they are looking at their children and thinking about something that is too large and too specific to describe efficiently to another person. Then she looked back at the journalist, and she said the thing that ended up closing every article, every television segment, every radio piece, every social media caption that attempted to summarize what had happened in Courtroom 7 on that Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. She said it simply, the way true things are usually said, without performance, without construction, without any apparent awareness that she was giving anyone a quote worth keeping. She doesn't remember the judge, Sarah said. She doesn't remember the lawyers or the jury or any of it. She remembers that there was a big dog who was sitting there all by himself and that she thought someone should check on him. She paused. And she remembers that he was really, really soft. The journalist wrote it down. She underlined it twice. She knew, the way writers know these things, that she had just been handed the last line of her piece, and that nothing she could write would improve upon it or belong after it. Because that was it. That was the whole of it, distilled down to its essential truth by the person who understood it most completely, because she had never understood it as anything other than what it simply was, a small girl who noticed someone sitting alone, and decided that someone should say something kind to them. No agenda. No awareness of the room or the occasion or the formality of the setting or the professional significance of the animal she was approaching. Just the pure, uncomplicated instinct of a person who has not yet learned to walk past the things that need acknowledging. Lily Malone had walked into Jefferson County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in a pink flower dress with uneven pigtails and a stuffed elephant named Gerald, and she had changed something in a dog, in a judge, in a courtroom, in a policy, in a precinct break room, in 47,000 people who shared a sketch before morning, in a veteran who wrote 2 pages about being seen, in a boy named Marcus who found his voice beside a dog, in a country that was tired and heavy and needed. More than almost anything, to be asked simply and directly whether it was doing okay. She had done all of this by noticing, by refusing to walk past, by deciding, with the absolute and uncomplicated authority of someone who has not yet been taught that some rooms are too serious for kindness, that the big dog near the witness stand deserved to have someone check on him. He did. They all did. They always do.